Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, August 2nd, 2021. And on this episode, I'm once again talking about the surveillance state because there's so much illegal, warrantless mass spying going on all around us. So I'm going to kick it off with a reminder that a tyranny, a despotism, a totalitarian state, whatever you want to call it, needs force to stay in power. And those types of governments, they need a huge surveillance apparatus, and they always want to watch everyone, because if they don't think that people are voluntarily going along with their laws, they're requiring force because they're such big totalitarian states, they need to watch people, or they want to watch people to ensure compliance, ensure that they're collecting as much money or stealing as much money as they can, and the like. So I'm going to kick it off with a reminder of that. And then I'm going to highlight some reports from recent months showing that even some of the more so-called innocuous federal agencies are engaged more and more in becoming part of this national and international surveillance state, keeping tabs on you, keeping records on you for years and years. Maybe even scanning social media posts to see who might fit a certain profile. So for some highlights on that, we're going to look at the USPS. I'm going to go back a little bit in history through social media monitoring. And then I've even got some interesting insight on the National Park Service, of all places. And I'm assuming that everything that we know about today is actually far worse. And we're going to hear more about it in a few years about how, well, why didn't you notice that, Bolden? Anyways, but first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you're going to find all the episodes for over 3 years now. And on individual episodes like this one today, which I publish about an hour or so after the live broadcast is done, you're going to find links to stuff that I'm talking about so you can read it in context and learn more on your own time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones, plus Odyssey.com, which is pretty awesome. We're also archive only on a number of places like Minds.com, Brighteon, BitChute, Gab TV, and elsewhere. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. There's even Facebook podcasts now. So whatever platform you want to be, we want to be there. If we're missing somewhere, please let me know. Or, of course, go to the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty to find everywhere that we are. And hopefully I've got that updated. You can also find our membership program where you can support us, put your financial faith for as little as $2 a month. And speaking of that, I want to say a quick, very brief hello and a thank you to everyone, to a number of people who have joined us as members lately, just a small handful. There's Alice in Arizona, Vincent in Florida, Tony in Ohio, Jennifer in Maryland, and then two Matthews. I got one in Kentucky, one in Ohio. I can't thank you enough for your support. I can't thank all of your continuing members. I can't even thank you enough for those of you who are just here. You're not able to financially back us, but you're here spreading the word, participating, learning, and sharing with others. I can't thank you enough. Let's take a quick moment to say hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people another moment to get notifications for the live stream. There's Tim Martin, Clay Kent, Haji, 1954, Patricia Dance, Bob Landry, Liberty Revolutionary, Ward Lawrence, good to see you, buddy. Been a while. Michael Bushnell, and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anybody, but let's get first of all to that warning. And I've been covering a lot of the anti-federalist papers from Brutus. I'm going to ramp that up. I'm going to cover some others from Cato and others, maybe Federal Farmer. But in the fourth paper, which I covered a couple of weeks ago, there was a really important quote in there, or a section where he was talking about a government is either going to get voluntary support, or it's going to have to rely on force in order to do what it wants. A free government is going to have voluntary support. Now, that may mean there are none on earth. And that might be a warning in and of itself. But a government that is not a free government for freedom has to use force and violence. And of course, I think we can think about this, that in order to keep tabs on what people are doing, in order to use that force to figure out who to use that force on, if it's not going to be on everyone all the time, they have to have a surveillance apparatus. Now, Brutus didn't get into the surveillance state part of it, but this is an interesting quote that I wanted to remind you guys of. He said, "Every government must be supported either by the people having such an attachment to it as to be ready when called upon to support it, or by a force at the command of the government to compel obedience. The latter mode destroys every idea of a free government. So if you've got a supposedly land of the free that is having to use violence to compel any part of the population, especially large parts like we have today, either you have one side being happy and just kind of being like, well, I'm okay with this now, and the other side being forced, and then vice versa, and it switches back and forth and back and forth. This is the totally opposite of the idea of a free government. But we were warned. Brutus told us, he said, the latter mode destroys every idea of a free government, for the same force that may be employed to compel obedience to good laws might and probably would be used to wrest from the people their constitutional liberties. And we know that governments based on force and control, they want surveillance of everything possible. We can think of Stalin, of course, wanting to have snitches everywhere, but now they have electronic versions of that. They don't need, we have snitches all around us. Humans that want to turn everyone in for anything and everything. They're always wanting to call the government to solve every problem. But we have electronic snitches all over the place. And so we shouldn't be surprised or even alarmed. And I know I shouldn't, but when I look at some of these reports, I'm like, oh my God, this is just getting out of hand, or it's always been out of hand. I shouldn't be surprised when I learn about these things. But every federal agency around us today is really turning into a surveillance agency. And I know some of you out there are already aware of this story that came out a few months ago, but let's talk about the United States Postal Service. And if we think about the necessary and proper clause, and I wasn't even thinking of mentioning this today when I was putting my notes together, the necessary and proper clause, the doctrine, the legal doctrine of principles and incidents. It makes clear, the founders were very clear about this. James Madison talked about it. They all understood the legal doctrine, including Brutus, who warned us that necessary and proper was going to be used as a way, especially in conjunction with the powers to tax, to have control over anything and everything. He even specifically said in his warnings that, look, I know this isn't how it's supposed to be. I know this isn't the right legal argument, but I recognize that people are going to look to the easiest way possible to define it in the years to come. And he warned that this was going to happen. But if you understand the actual legal meaning of necessary and proper, that is principles and incidents, you have a principal power, and the only things that are authorized underneath it are those that are incidental to the main power. They're lesser than the main power. They're absolutely necessary to carry out the main power. And they can't be larger. They can't be overwhelm it. They also have to be proper. They have to be authorized under the Constitution as well. So the idea of the United States Postal Service being delegated power to Congress to establish post offices, for example, they, of course, can hire a manager to run a post office. They can hire, they can hire people to buy land. They can lease property. They have to do all these things, and they have to have other stuff done other than just delivering mail. They might have to do advertising, so then they have to go out and get an advertising agency. This is both necessary to carry out the day-to-day functions and proper to do so because it isn't something completely different. Now, if they started running department stores or electronic stores, that's something different than just running the mail. They're actually selling the products as well. And same with surveillance. Now, they're going to make an argument. The United States Postal Service makes the argument that, well, they're, keeping the country safe, keeping the mail safe, but they're not even doing surveillance just to keep the mail safe. And I'm not sure how much they have to do for that either. But here from Yahoo News, this is all the way back in April when it first broke, and Yahoo of all places broke this story. This is from Jana Winter. She says, the law enforcement arm of the United States Postal Service has been quietly running a program that tracks and collects Americans' social media posts, including those about planned protests, according to a document obtained by Yahoo News. I will link to this in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty so you can check it out and read the whole thing on your own time. They put it further like this: the details of the surveillance effort. We know they're just basically scooping up all this information. And why? We're going to learn that they're doing this because they're trying to find out who might be having violent protests. Interesting. It sounds like a job for maybe the FBI or a different agency. The USPS is meant to deliver mail, not packages. not to do this. That's for somebody else. Anyways, the details of the surveillance effort, known as ICOP, or Internet Covert Operations Program, have not previously been made public. And this is the way it always is. We only learn about it after the fact. And it's likely that the USPS has been doing this for a number of years. The work involves having analysts trawl through social media sites to look for what the document describes as inflammatory postings, and then share that information across government agencies. Now, maybe if all these other government agencies, well, most of them shouldn't exist in the first place, but the ones that do are doing all kinds of stuff they shouldn't be doing in the first place. And so if we look at most federal programs relying on state governments to do the stuff that they want to do, they're definitely overextended. So maybe someone's trying to find a way to make the USPS profitable or busy or whatever it may be, but they're certainly doing stuff that was never delegated. Well, first of all, the idea of mass warrantless surveillance that does not have an oath or affirmation, probable cause, particularly describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized, this is not delegated to the federal government in the first place. They're not supposed to be keeping tabs on people just for posting on social media or talking about a protest or whatever the general topic is. And even if they could do that, that's not something that the mail service is supposed to be authorized. I wonder what Benjamin Franklin would have had to say about that. Something about liberty and security, seeing he was, I think he was he the first postmaster? Someone can tell me in the live chat. Anyways, here from a post that we published on our site, they say, this is from Jay Private, ICOP monitors social media posts about protests and forwards that information to fusion centers. Fusion centers are these kind of quasi-state federal things. In Maine, for example, there's been an effort to defund the state fusion center. It's oftentimes funded with state dollars, and then it's a partnership between feds and states. And then this is a place where they're just sending all the data and then sharing it all across the country. Analysts with the USPS Internet Covert Operations Program monitored significant activity regarding planned protests occurring internationally and domestically on March 20th, 2021, says the March 16th government bulletin, marked as law enforcement sensitive and distributed through the Department of Homeland Security's fusion centers. And Jay Private continues, he says, DHS, or she, I'm not sure, DHS has succeeded in turning the Postal Service into a clandestine government agencies. ICOP analysts are currently monitoring these social media channels for any potential threats stemming from the scheduled protests and will disseminate intelligence updates as needed, the bulletin says. Now, if there's yet another surveillance agency, even if you think, oh, well, the Postal Service has a reason to do this regarding just a short series of protests, they're only going to do it temporary. I'm not sure how they have the infrastructure to just do it for a week or a month and then just disband it all. We're not hearing about them tearing down or adding parts to that agency. So they're certainly doing this stuff on a regular basis. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think, well, now we have a new surveillance agency, and they're going to be using it for other stuff in the future as well. And here's how Jay Private put it. All of this really shouldn't come as a surprise. We shouldn't be surprised. I'm surprised when I read about it. I shouldn't be surprised. I know this, and I've had plenty of people say, Bolden, don't be surprised about this stuff, because they're all spying on us. I mean, if you think about the Department of Education, they have an enforcement arm. The FDA has armed enforcement agents. The entire government is totalitarian, even the ones that you don't think about being the worst of the worst. It shouldn't come as a surprise. A 2019 USPS annual report revealed the existence of this program, albeit in less ominous terms. Page 36 of the report says ICOP is one of 7 functional groups that sends hundreds of intelligence reports to fusion centers. And a 2019 Federal News Network article revealed how ICOP postal inspectors have been going undercover on the dark web since at least 2014. So they've at least been looking on the dark web. And I think the justification, it always starts out with something to get the foot in the door. The justification was the dark web was used to buy and sell illegal products. The USPS law enforcement arm then says, well, They're shipping this stuff oftentimes. So we want to find the source of this, and we're not going to participate in shipping stuff that the federal government says is illegal. So it's prohibition that leads to another problem, that leads to another problem, that leads to another problem. And the solution is always more surveillance, more government, more spending, more control all the time. So the source of the problem is that the government needs to get the hell out of our lives in most situations, and it doesn't. And the solutions they have is always going to create more problems. And in this interview, there's Michael Ray, who was inspector of charge and cybercrime at the Postal Inspection Service, basically didn't come right out and say it, but basically implied that they've been surveilling people's social media posts since at least 2014. And if we're going to use my rule of thumb on this, if we are hearing that they've been doing this since at least 2014, they've been probably doing this since as long as Facebook has been around. They've probably been doing it since day one. And they are doing it much broader than we even know through a few documents. Anyways, back to the Yahoo report. This is just a quote from a law professor. "It's a mystery," said University of Chicago law professor Jeffrey Stone. "I don't understand why the government would go to the Postal Service for examining the internet for security issues. Of course, they're going to work with, if there is a legitimate thing that they really need to stop, someone sending violence, stuff that is going to conduct violence through the mail." I'm trying to say this in a way that the internet censors don't. See how internet censorship causes you to pause? And I've heard people, this is just a quick side note, and I recognize that I don't want government to come in and protect me from social media, but the notion that we have these kind of overlords that are basically patrolling our speech. Sometimes it's under threat from government. Sometimes it's because the social channels or social platforms just want to be as woke as possible, or just want to keep people shut up from saying things that they don't want to hear. Well, the end result is that it kind of chills free speech. I find myself doing this, and I just want to let you know I caught myself doing this right now. I stumbled and I paused for a moment. Am I saying something that my technology overlords don't want me to say, and I don't want to lose my channel? Anyways, just a side note. I don't understand why the government would go to the Postal Service examining the internet for security issues. Again, we shouldn't be surprised. This isn't anything new. Here from Epic. Is this from Epic? No, this is from ACLU. This is actually a pretty good post. Social media monitoring software can be used to geographically track us as we communicate. So as they're just trolling the internet, they're trolling social media posts, they're scooping up all this information, they're using algorithms and platforms and things like that. Of course, they're telling us, oh, it was just for maybe violence and protests at a certain time. But the infrastructure's been there a long time, and we know when they're collecting this data, they're tapping into it, they have the ability to do much more than what they're saying. And if they have the ability, we know someone with power is probably using it and trying to expand it. It says it can chart our relationships, networks, and associations. It can monitor protests, identify the leaders of political and social movements, and measure our influence. It is also promoted as a predictor of future events. If you've seen my episodes covering predictive policing, this is becoming much more commonplace in the law enforcement community, both state, local, and on the federal level. And I guess we're going to have to include the United States Postal Service in this as well. They're looking at past behavior as an indicator, or certain associations as an indicator of potential future threats. Here in Los Angeles, LAPD has been notorious, at least amongst privacy activists, for putting people on these lists and then literally showing up, sending an officer to stalk them sometimes, showing up at the door, just checking in to make sure everything's okay here. And that's how bad this type of stuff gets. It's a predictor of future events, including threat assessment, and as an instrument for manipulating public opinion. And I even myself, not that it wasn't even manipulating public opinion, but it was causing me to kind of think about what I'm saying. I don't want to get banned. So that's the type of thing it does as well. Instead of specific criminal activity prompting an investigation, they write, investigators use social media monitoring software, SMMS, to cast nets so wide They encompass the entire internet. And if we're especially talking about the federal government, they are restricted, or they're supposed to be restricted under the Fourth Amendment. A warrant based on probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized. It's not particular when the net is cast so wide that it covers the entire interwebs. Anyways, a single Facebook post or tweet may be all it takes to place someone on a watch list, says the ACLU, with effects that can range from repeated invasive screening at airports. I've gone through that. I'm not sure if I'm on a watch list. Most people can never find out if they are, but I know I've definitely gotten pulled aside many, many times when I've traveled, although I haven't been doing that so much the last few years. Invasive screening at airports, they say, to detention and questioning in the United States or abroad. A single post, a single social post could get you put on a list. And the more agencies that are doing this, the more people that are going to be on lists. And the more that people are on lists, well, think of how someone might use it in the future if you love the people in power today, which you shouldn't. More broadly, they write, there's good reason to be alarmed about the chilling effect that social media surveillance will have on speech and expression. And I just did it myself, and I'm going to just keep kind of hammering on myself for that. I know I do this maybe, I don't know, I would say once every week or two. I'm literally talking. I've got a stream of blab coming out of my mouth, and I pause as I'm speaking to make sure I don't say a particular word to not get flagged on social accounts. It's bad news. In one major study, they say even people who said they had nothing to hide were highly likely to self-censor online when they knew the government was watching. And as these reports come out, we're reminded every single day that they're watching. And maybe my tinfoil hat size says, well, they like it when these reports come out because the surveillance itself, mass surveillance, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack. It's really not a good approach. That's why they like, when they're really going after people, they get the local law enforcement to use the more granular tools like cell site simulators, local surveillance, facial recognition, and things like that. Because on a national or international level, they've just got so much stuff to scroll through. There's so much stuff to kind of break down the data to figure out who's who. And sometimes my head goes, well, they like it when this stuff gets leaked because it tells everybody that they're being spied on all the time. And that does what they want it to do, which helps chill free speech. So people are likely to self-censor online when they knew the government was watching. That inevitably leads to an impoverished discourse and reluctance to criticize the government. Screw the government. I'm not going to be reluctant. They're terrible, evil monsters. Going further, I just wanted to point out that you can't just sit idly by. You have to actually avoid the precedent. You have to recognize that even if you think it's being done for one small time, one small moment, one small issue, or done by people that you like, it's the precedent that's a problem. And I did an episode on this covering the founders' views, warning about the tiniest of the tiniest of the tiniest of precedents that required resistance because the precedent will always be built upon. I will link to that episode in the show notes. When Our Rights Are Invaded, the founders on precedent and resistance. It reminds me of the great James Otis Jr. quote. He says, when our rights are invaded, and that's where I got the title from, it's high time to throw aside prudence. Anyways, here from epic.org, they're talking about social media monitoring as well. If we're looking at the history of this, they say through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2011, many of you may not have really been active on social platforms. Some of the social platforms we have today really didn't even exist at the time, and they certainly weren't as prominent as they are today. But Epic was the first to uncover information in 2011 about a social media monitoring program by a federal agency. They already discovered it in 2011. So if it already was leaked out at that point, it certainly had been used for years prior, whether it was on Facebook 2008 or 2009 or back in the MySpace days. I had a job at some point years ago where I did social media marketing. Before that was really a kind of a job description for a lot of people. I did social media marketing under MySpace. I think Friendster even at some point too, just trying to reach people in that realm. So in Epic versus DHS, Department of Homeland Security, Epic obtained nearly 300 pages of documents. This was in a Freedom of Information Act request in 2011, so they were aware of this happening. 300 pages of documents they were able to access that far back about DHS's monitoring of social media data. The documents clearly showed that the monitoring program was more expansive than DHS had communicated to the public. This is just a reminder that whenever we hear about something, when they tell us voluntarily or documents get released, there's always much more happening. So when we learn that the USPS was monitoring social media for potential violence or some kind of protest or something happening in March, we know it's much more likely that they're doing it all the time for way more reasons as well. And this is just another reminder of that. That is the kind of the standard that I go with. DHS paid General Dynamics, Epic found out, to monitor. This is real deep state stuff going on here, military-industrial complex stuff. So all those war contractors, we want to have the largest military in the face of the planet, in the history of the planet, 10 times around. Well, they're spending a lot of money on stuff that even if you want to have a strong military, they're definitely spending money on all kinds of other stuff too. General Dynamics, a military contractor, is paid to monitor public social media communications on the internet. And in a way, even though this is done by DHS, this is kind of a military operation against the people. It's a military operation attacking liberty. DHS stated that the purpose of the program back to Epic was to identify threats to public safety and national security. So they're like, okay, yeah, you caught us, but this is what we're doing. We're just doing national security, public safety in this agency, DHS, which didn't even exist a few years earlier. But anyways, the records Epic attained demonstrated that DHS was also monitoring the political views of Americans. They were keeping tabs on political views of people as far back as 2011 and even earlier. If they're doing social media monitoring that had already broken out to the public to the point where there was a lawsuit and a Freedom of Information Act request, there's 300 pages of documents. They say they're just doing national security. Well, to them, political views of people probably is national security. And to a lot of people today, it really is as well, but it isn't. It shouldn't be. And as soon as you give them that precedent, they're going to start using it. Anyways, they say DHS monitored the internet for criticisms of the DHS and maintained name-identified records. The DHS 10 plus years ago had already been keeping track of people by name who were criticizing the DHS. That's all you needed to do was say the DHS sucks. The DHS shouldn't exist. The DHS never should have existed. We should reject the DHS. Saying things like that, which are all things that I believe will get your name on a list that the DHS doesn't like you. Here they say, let's look at some of the other agencies. If we're looking at all these people that are spying on us, doing social media monitoring, it's not just DHS. And of course, it's not going to be just the United States Postal Service. How do you get from DHS broadly to USPS? Well, you've got a few steps in between. In June 17, the State Department formally implemented a questionnaire for a subset of visa applications that required the disclosure of their social media handles for the last 5 years. The State Department also uses social media monitoring as a public relations strategy. Again, who doesn't like the foreign policy of the United States? Well, let's figure out what's going on, and we want to do PR for the federal government. Well, stop doing stuff, and you won't have to do so much PR. That can mitigate the worst impacts of damaging effects. The strategy is to promote resiliency in responding to world events that threaten the national interest of the U.S. and its citizens. To do so, the department uses real-time monitoring and identification and cultivation of key online influencers. So the State Department is cultivating influencers. You're on Instagram, you're on TikTok, whatever, you may be seeing an interesting influencer talking about stuff or doing creative things or doing some mainstream garbage. Who knows what it is? Some of them are State Department assets. Absolutely. And if they're State Department assets, we can be sure, my conspiracy side is right, that there's also CIA assets out there as well. We know this is happening. This has already been released in documents. Epic backs all their stuff up. The state governments also do this. Here is an example. The Oregon Department of Justice reportedly used a tool called the digital stakeout A social media monitoring software used to surveil people. The software can be used to covertly monitor, collect, and analyze social media data from various platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And then we have the FBI, of course. According to FBI contracting documents, the FBI has hired data miner to monitor in real time more than 500 million daily tweets. 500 million they're monitoring in real time. They probably have some kind of algorithm that's way over my head to be able to explain or talk about, but they're keeping track, keeping tabs of people for what they're saying, their political views, and people are getting categorized in certain ways. And someone in the future, even if you think that the people today aren't so evil, someone in the future will be, and they will certainly use that in really, really scary ways. Data miner uses public social media platforms, this is back to the Epic report, to detect early indications of high-impact events and critical breaking information, and transforms them into real-time alerts for its clients. Anyways, with all that, that's a kind of a brief history of social media monitoring from USPS today going back to DHS over 10 years ago, the state governments, the state departments, the FBI, and the like. It's much broader than anything that I can share with you. But we also have some kind of surveillance happening, not the same level, but I'm certain it'll grow to that over time, from the National Park Service. And here from J. Private again, according to a notice published in the Federal Register, the Department of the Interior, DOI, is turning the National Park Service, the NPS, into a mirror image of the NSA, FBI, DHS, and every other three-letter spy agency you can think of. And some people might say, from the information that follows, it's not to the level of NSA, FBI, DHS. It certainly isn't yet. But the seeds of this are set to grow. If the Postal Service is basically monitoring social media posts all day, every day, all the time, and then forwarding hundreds of reports over to fusion centers, it's doing stuff that has nothing to do with its actual function. We shouldn't be surprised when the National Park Service probably expands to that in the future. Pursuant to the provisions of the Privacy Act, this is from the notice in the Federal Register, as amended, the Interior is issuing a public notice of its intent to modify the National Park Service Privacy Act system of records, blah, blah, blah. So if you apply for a permit in a national park to do an event, a wedding, I don't know, a graduation, something like that, they are now collecting what J. Private says is a disturbing amount of personal information on national park visitors. As NextGov points out, anyone wishing to get a permit to use one of America's 423 national parks will have all their personal information sent to the White House. Literally goes right to the White House. If you want to get a permit for a national park, don't go to the national parks then. I mean, don't get permits, I guess. NPS issues permits for 3 types of uses. This is in their own paper. Of course, this also shows how the nasty, absurd, illegal, unconstitutional war on terror is basically targeting picnics and family gatherings. So they issue permits for 3 types of uses. Standard events like weddings, sports, picnics, and family gatherings. Special events like demonstrations, races, tournaments, and the like. And construction, research, and utility work. But when a park user applies for the permit, the system collects a ton of data. Things like their name, date of birth, social security number, tax ID number, address, telephone number, all that stuff. They're collecting tons of information. Vehicle, VIN number, plate number, blah, blah, blah. It seems like what you would just, okay, these are the people that are going to be here. But they're sending that information along to other agencies. They're collecting the information. They're actually keeping it. They're specifically telling us they're keeping it for 15 years. And they promise to get rid of it if it turns out that there's no problems. But they're holding on to your information for 15 years. They're sending it to the White House. They're sharing it with the Department of Justice. They're sharing it with what they say is any official of any federal agency that is appropriate, news media, and the public. So they're sharing this information all over the place. And here from the report, page 7 of the notice reveals that the National Park Service will routinely send everyone's personal information to numerous federal agencies. Again, the NPS memo says they're going to keep everyone's personal information for 15 years. So they're putting this stuff in databases. They're sharing it with all these other federal agencies and even pointing out that they may share it with the news media and the public. So far, we're just relying on them to not share it all the time. Maybe they will in the future. Maybe they'll only share it when there's a catastrophic event and they have to reserve that authority. But should we trust them? I would absolutely say no. And I think the way to sum this whole thing up is to ask a question. Where in the Constitution is the federal government delegated the power to run a mass warrantless surveillance program? And of course, I think if you're like me, you're going to say it doesn't exist and we should oppose and resist it in every way possible. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More than anything, I hope you learned something. I will take a look over in the live chat, see if I can answer any questions here in just a moment. But a quick reminder, if you support the show, you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you want to help us spread the word, but you're not able to kick in financially, don't worry about it. We're going to keep doing the show one way or the other, but you can still help us out with a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments live and in the archive. That helps out. Liking whatever platform you're using, subscribing, getting notifications, all this stuff helps trigger the algorithm of the platforms, primarily the mainstream ones, that you may watch or listen on, and it tells that platform to show the program to more people. Anyways, let me take a quick look over in the live chat to see if I can get a few good ones here. Justin Bayola, thanks, MB. Your work is much appreciated. Great show. Good to see you, Justin Bayola. Clay Kent says, never, ever, ever trust the government. Absolutely. Trust no one living with the power to endanger the public liberty, said John Adams back when he was a good guy before he turned into one of these with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Michael D says, sitting poolside on vacation, watching and listening. That's awesome. I really appreciate it. Haji says, another great show. Patricia Dance makes a really good point here, though. She says, too many people love tyranny. Too many people. And I think this is something that we should remind ourselves of all the time. I don't want to turn neighbor against neighbor, family member against family member. But government exists with the support of the people. If people didn't keep choosing and demanding and begging and asking for this stuff, I don't actually see it as a top-down situation. I see it as people are okay with this. People are not opposing it on any wide scale. We're very small in numbers. But that doesn't mean, even though the odds are so much against us, that we just have to be like, this is insurmountable. Because I believe that no matter how much the odds are against us, no matter how much they're stacked against us, no matter how insurmountable things may seem, we have to stand on a principle for us here at the TAC, that is the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, and no excuses. And M. Gabriel makes a good point. If information is being gathered, and this is what I'm talking about, they're not just using it for what they tell us. They're always going to use it for more. And if they can't use it for what they tell us, they're going to create these profiles. So if the DHS over a decade ago was already looking to see who was criticizing them online and then keeping tabs on them with their name over a decade ago, they're definitely going to use it. And that's what M. Gabriel says. If information is being gathered, it either maybe, will be, or is actively being used to surveil and control people. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you had a great weekend. I will look more in the chat a little bit later today. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, if you've got questions or comments. I get a lot of great ideas from the comment section and emails for future episodes. I'm going to do another episode pretty soon on Brutus paper number 6 I'm actually getting to, maybe on Wednesday, unless I've got something else coming up. And then I'm also planning on doing an episode on Benjamin Franklin, his views from the 1760s on the negative effects of welfare programs, where I came across a quote that I should have known all along that Mike Meharry knew about. He's like, but I've never put it in full context. So Mike is working on an article maybe this week or next that I'll cover, talking about how even back then, he sounded almost like a libertarian of today. Benjamin Franklin was saying, like, look, if you pass a law taking taxes from people in order to help people get out of poverty, you shouldn't be surprised when you're actually subsidizing. You're getting more of the same. So war on poverty, war on drugs, war on terror. Every time the government gets involved in something, we get more. They do a war on something, we get more of what they're claiming to get rid of. I think that'll be a really interesting one. If you've got ideas for future episodes, I definitely want to hear about that. And again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great day. I hope you had a great weekend. And I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.